So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wynn-Grant.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Nothing makes me more nervous than presenting to my own community. So thank you. There's so many faces in here that I know personally and that I know from the office and my past, and so it means just so much to have everyone's support here for the final Pacific Views series of the year. So I have this book that I've been going around North America with this last month, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm going to essentially kind of give the arc of the book, which just happens to also be my life so far. So easy to talk about myself for a long time. And I'm going to read a passage. It was hard for me to figure out what passage I might read. There's a bunch of stories in here. So I'm going to read a passage that is much less about me and much more a story of something that really changed my perspective and helped me realize some of the miseducation that I'd received as an environmental scientist, and really helped me reimagine how environmental science can best be effective and work for people and communities. So a big turning point in my life that I hope will resonate with you all. And then we have time for Q&A, and I'm really interested to see what that'll be like, because I know we have a mix of students and faculty and community members here with us. So just think of your best questions and bring it on. So thank you again for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to try not to walk in front of the screen, but I might just do that because that's what I do. But my name is Rae, and I love wild animals, and I have for a long, long time. And I'm very fortunate that in my research career, I spend a lot of time kind of getting up close and personal with wild animals. So bears is something that I'm known for studying. And in this picture, I am attaching a GPS collar to a sedated black bear who is hibernating, and that's one way that we monitor them and learn about their movements and can help inform conservation. I probably spend a lot more time with bear poop than actual bears, so that's also how I get up close and personal with them, along with many other wild animals. And I have moved in so many different directions in my career recently, but I can't really shake ecology. Just the ecology of wild animals will always remain so fascinating to me. I just geek out on ecology. I'm not going to talk about a lot of research and ecology tonight. So again, find me later if you want to geek out with me on those topics. So I'm this person, and particularly at UCSB, I help lead carnivore research on the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve, and I am going to talk about that for a bit in my talk. And I'm also these days this person, so right now it is the season of talking about my book, which is called Wildlife, and it is also the season of working on this television show. Many of you maybe have heard of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. It debuted in 1963. On NBC, and so it's in its 61st year, and it just came back, and I'm fortunate to be a part of that team. And we just got good news that we have been nominated for 4 Emmy Awards for season 1, which is pretty freaking awesome. And here's an interesting spoiler. I wrote my book by a miracle. I wasn't too late with my deadline, and it really focused on my childhood dream, which was hosting a nature show. And I talked about all the different nature shows I watched as a kid, which were a number of them, but included Wild Kingdom. And then I turned in my book, and I was just, you know, regular schmegular me, no TV show. And right before the final edits were due, I got the phone call from Wild Kingdom saying that they were going to revive the show and would I want to be a part of it. And so I called my editor and I said, "You will not believe what just happened." Because I didn't audition and I didn't apply. It was extremely spontaneous on my end. So if you believe in manifestation, then there's a lesson there. But I got that little bit into the book right before it was published. So these days I spend 80% of my time in nature. It's pretty freaking cool to have my office be the outdoors. For some of you in here, I know that that's the case with you too. But as I was growing up, that was very different. So I grew up very, very urban, and it was wonderful. So not urban in a bad way, but urban in the very best way. The cities and the concrete were my jungle, and that was great. So I come from a very traditional urban Black family. This picture is from when I was little, and we lived in a pretty low-income community in Cincinnati, Ohio, for a very brief time. And my exposure to nature was making mud pies in the alley next to my house. And that was pretty much good enough for me. But where I was really the most exposed and where my spark for science came from was inside. So when I would sit inside, which was a lot of the time, I would turn on the television and I would veg out and watch natural history programs. And this is, not some kind of talk to let your kids watch hours and hours of TV every day. But I will say that that's how my mind got opened to science. It was those shows that showed me wild animals and the people who worked with them, because I had no idea that there were jobs or careers in wildlife ecology or conservation. But television brought me there. So all those British and Australian, middle-aged white guys were absolutely my heroes, still are, many of them. But they were so different from me. And so I actually, when I was a kid, really thought, the one thing I want in life is to be a nature show host. But I know that I can't be, because those people that I see on the TV, there's no bio of them, right? So you don't get to see what their journey was to get there. And I used to assume well, they just knew about ecology. They must have just talked about ecology around the dinner table every night. It was just inherent in their families, and that's not accessible to me. And so I went to kindergarten and said to my kindergarten teacher when I was 6, I want to be a nature show host when I grow up. And I went to college in Atlanta, Georgia, so another urban center. And in the first week of school, I said to my advisor, I want to be a nature show host when I grow up. So what do I major in here so that I can do that? And I remember my advisor said, gosh, would that be drama and theater or maybe journalism? And then said, environmental science. Let's go with that, environmental science. And I said, great, never heard of it, but I'll give it a shot. And off I went to the environmental science department, which, as you can imagine, was a hit. So I got there, I fell in love, I realized, aha, the biographies of all these nature show hosts must have included environmental science at some point. I'm in the right place. And I really sunk into that, and it was very helpful because it was in that department that I kind of realized, you know what? There's more to this nature show host thing. It's cool to be on TV and to, be able to communicate that science, but this is a mission-critical field, I learned. There's a lot of environmental challenges going on, and these people can train me to be a solution maker. So it's very purposeful. And I really dove in. But after a couple of years, I felt unsure again. And I kind of realized, what's missing? Everyone around me in these classes is here because they love nature, because they've spent time in nature. They all have gone on hikes and been to national parks with their family. I had never done anything like that. So a couple of years into my environmental science degree, I decided, okay, that's it, got to get outside. And I decided to look for the most intense wildlife ecology study abroad program that I could find. And I found it. And it was a wildlife management program that would take me all the way to southern Kenya to live in the bush in a campsite in southern Kenya, right outside of Amboseli National Park, and study wild animals and their ecology and conservation for a semester. And off I went. I was 20 years old. And it was, oh, and I have a picture. This is me on my 20th birthday. and it was taken with film. I still like it. And I was in Kimana, Kenya, or Kitengela, Kenya, right outside of Nairobi, and I was so happy because, you know, my first week there, I went on my first hike, and I pitched my first tent, and I saw my first ever wild animal ever. And I also met the only black scientists that I had ever met before. So our professors were black African ecologists, Kenyan ecologists, who had gone off to different parts of Europe and the United States to get their PhDs and returned to Kenya to teach the next generation of ecologists. And so for the first time in my life, not only was I in the field and in the outdoors, extremely outdoors, but I was also being taught by people who looked more like me than the nature show hosts and the professors that I had had before. And that was extra powerful because I was doing the work, but I was being empowered by people who really saw similarities between us. And again, I'm going to say this is going to be like a broken record, but because I was so into these television shows, which always focus on like the biggest, most ferocious, most charismatic animals, as soon as I got there, I said, lions, I want to study lions, it's got to be lions, 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 lions. And I began a study of big cat ecology and conservation. And so this was the year 2005. And so back at home in Atlanta, where my university was, we had internet, right? There was no Wi-Fi back then, but we had the internet. You had to plug it in, all of that. And in parts of Kenya, of course, there was also internet availability. But where we were staying, there was no electricity. There was certainly no Wi-Fi access or internet access. And the only way that we could connect with home as 20-year-olds was through snail mail. So I would write letters to my family. They would write letters and postcards to me. And it would take about a month for mail to get, you know, across the ocean, and for us to, you know, have a car go to Nairobi to pick it up, and then it's a little bit corrupt, so you have to pay for your own mail, and, you know, just pretty ridiculous. So I bring that up because I was in Kenya for the month of August and September, just getting my life, just getting exposed to everything that jazzed me up the most, and sinking into the wild animals and the wild places that we were studying them. And then I got the first package, the first care package from my parents, having been completely cut off. And it included some CDs and some books and some letters, and also a Time magazine issue, a special report. That was this one, because Hurricane Katrina had hit the United States since we had been gone on the study abroad program. And, you know, many of us remember that, if not all of us remember Hurricane Katrina. It was mismanaged. There was a lot of death. About 1,000 people or so perished in the hurricane, and many more lost their property and never recovered very well. And it was a highly racialized incident, especially in terms of the response from the government. Who got evacuated, who didn't. And so I found myself in this, you know, heaven of nature and animals and ecology. And yet in this moment, I realized that I would never be able to have that pure experience of just doing science, just alone. That no matter where I was in the world, I would always need to be connected to my community, to the Black community, and to social justice issues that were impacting my community. Because that's a part of my identity that I couldn't escape. I couldn't run off to another country or continent and get rid of that. It would follow me everywhere. And it was important. And so it was in that moment, at age 20, that I kind of realized I'm always going to have to do both and be both and infuse both of these things together. Ecology and wildlife conservation with social justice and the empowerment of communities that have faced marginalization. And I think that's probably what drove me into human-wildlife conflict as an area of scholarship because it includes what's going on from the animal's perspective, but also what's going on from the community's perspective and how we can find solutions that work for both groups. So I carried that with me for a long time, and I worked in different parts of East Africa for a long time on lion issues. And here's where I'm going to pause and read a synopsis from my book, or not a synopsis, I'm sorry, just a passage, and it's super long, so I'm going to skip around. So you guys don't have to listen to the whole thing, but if you're in suspense, you can buy the book. But this is a long passage, and it takes place during my master's degree. So I went on, I could not get enough of East African wildlife, and in particular studying lions. And so I was spending about 4 months in central Tanzania studying a population of lions with the African Wildlife Foundation. And again, something that was really, and this image actually has nothing to do with this right now. It's just a pretty picture that's like a placeholder. This is Western Nevada. So, just a little different. But I was working with the African Wildlife Foundation, which at the time was just a tremendous organization, still is, but at the time was lesser known. And one thing that I really appreciated about that research experience was that I was, again, camping for 4 months in the bush with a small team of researchers, and everyone was a Black Tanzanian person who had been educated in different parts of the world but returned to Tanzania to do this lion work and work on human-lion conflict. So I was really learning from people who had a very strong connection to where we were. And that plays into this passage. So I was out on a drive with my colleague, his name is Peter, and he was from the Maasai community that was adjacent to this national park. We were outside of the national park. And we were spending the day, we would look for lions. So this was before we had GPS collars, and so we'd use radio telemetry to find them. And then we'd get close enough and we'd count how many were there, and then we would try to zoom in with our binoculars on their faces. Lions all have a unique whisker pattern, so the little freckles on their faces where their whiskers sprout from are unique on every individual. And so you can identify individuals that way. So that was my job, was to look at my binoculars and then sketch out the whisker pattern of a lion's face. It was an incredible way to spend time. And so we're out one day, and on our transistor radio, a call came through saying that something bad had really happened. So here we go. We followed the park rangers as they drove fast down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust so thick we could barely see through our windshield. It felt like a high-speed chase with cop cars racing to a crime scene. We listened to our transistor radio. Harried voices clamored to speak over each other. Peter translated the conversation. Okay, there were 3 poachers. They've been captured, but we're too late. He paused before speaking again. They killed a giraffe, an adult female. The magnitude of the news hit us simultaneously. I turned from looking at him to facing forward in my seat, gripping the door handle to steady myself as our truck whipped around curves. My brain went into overdrive, trying to comprehend that armed poachers were afoot in our area, and they'd been successful. And with something as large and majestic as a giraffe, a female, potentially a mother or possibly pregnant. Although I was familiar with the statistics of how frequently poaching happens, I was devastated. Skipping. I could see the giraffe in the distance and realized I'd never seen a giraffe lying down. Giraffes don't lie down. Because of the weight of their bodies and necks, it takes them a long time to rise, even from a seated position, let alone laying down. So giraffes usually rest while standing up. But this female giraffe was lying flat on the red earth, her final resting place. I counted 6 park rangers dressed in military green uniforms and government-issued caps with machine guns slung around their torsos. In the back of one pickup truck sat 3 young men in tattered black clothing, handcuffed, their heads hanging down. No question, they were the people who'd been caught poaching. The tension was palpable. One ranger guarded the truck with the poachers, another was in the driver's seat, and the 4 others stood next to the giraffe. While various feelings swirled within me, the scientific part of my brain gravitated toward logistics. Well, what do we do now? Well, now we're all going to take some, Peter said. Take some of what? He stared deep into my eyes as he replied, signaling for me to not question the decision. We're all going to take some of the giraffe. A giraffe can weigh thousands of pounds, and this one offered about a ton of muscle tissue. Peter, slightly gentler now with his delivery, explained that the amount of meat sitting in front of us could feed many people for a long time, but we had to act fast. We were in the bush with no electricity and thus no refrigeration. All of this had to happen while the meat was still fresh and before nightfall, when carnivores would scavenge the carcass. While my mind had been racing with potential next steps moments before, this idea hadn't dawned on me. Of course, this community of indigenous people who had shared land with wildlife for millennia already had a protocol for when an animal is illegally killed. A glimmer of hope grew within me. I didn't have to be completely powerless in this tragic situation. I could be active in a solution. Optimism and action are parts of my core essence, and in that moment, I blossomed back into the Rae who learns, understands, and helps. I ran over to our truck and grabbed 2 big machetes. Before I knew it, Peter raised his arm high, almost like he was wielding an axe, and brought it down hard, hacking into the hip area and cutting meat from the dead giraffe's body. I estimated that each piece was roughly 20 pounds as I hauled giraffe hunks to the back of our truck over and over again. I was getting into the rhythm when I glanced up, my eyes spotting something moving on the horizon about half a mile away. A single file line of Maasai women appeared, beautiful cloths draped over their bodies, slowly approaching our giraffe poaching site. Brilliant reds and blues and whites against dark brown skin created a rainbow of vibrant hope. Around 50 women came, many of them carrying big empty baskets on their heads. It was powerful to see women I believe to be the foundation of their communities, walking for what must have been several miles to the site of a dead giraffe. The giraffe's unnatural death, a violent crime, was extremely upsetting to Peter, to the other park rangers, and to myself. My conservation science training drilled into me that any and all poaching was bad. Yet here were the Maasai women who would now be able to bring several days' worth of essential protein back to their homes for their children, partners, family, and community. This is what's missing from the conservation conversations in my classrooms, I thought. The nuance, the duality, the fact that the death of one can transition right into life for another. I also thought about the way the inequalities of incarceration were bundled up in this situation. 3 young Black African men had been arrested and would likely go to prison, ruining their lives and potentially the lives of their families. For all anyone knew, their choice to take on a physically dangerous and legally risky job opportunity had been made out of desperation rather than greed or bloodthirst. And would incarcerating these men truly be an important step toward reducing wildlife poaching in this part of Tanzania? Or would these foot soldiers of the illegal wildlife trade be replaced by whichever kingpin was managing this crime ring from a place of protection? Just as I had seen back home in my communities in the United States, I was beginning to realize that perhaps the issue at hand wasn't wildlife crime, but the resource needs of Black communities. I looked at my palms, stained dark red with giraffe blood. I instinctively lifted them to my nose to smell and inhaled a sharp odor I can only describe as liquid warmth. Wildlife poaching is a tragedy, full stop. I believe these animals have inherent value and should live beautiful, full, safe lives. And scientifically, many of these animals are critical ecosystem engineers, without whom our environments would collapse. I also believe that the illegal wildlife trade, second in magnitude only to the illegal drug trade, needs to be ended and soon. At the same time, based on my lived experiences, community members' input, and my own research, I believe it's important to expand our understanding of what poaching is and isn't, and especially how we got to this place. Giraffes, once in the multi-millions across sub-Saharan Africa, drastically declined in population during European colonial rule, largely as a result of the sport hunting and land development driven by economically powerful white people. So today, with fewer giraffes than ever and highly racialized economic inequality across Africa, one person's life can be snuffed out because of killing one giraffe. My science background had trained me to only see the wildlife problem and stay blind to the human problem. Yet there I was, hands soaked, waiting to greet women from the nearby villages as we turned a setback into an opportunity. By the time Peter and I returned to our field station, word of the adventure had preceded us, as had a large hunk of giraffe meat, which was stewing in our cauldron, along with the handful of onions, tomatoes, and spices that we had. Peter and I hadn't taken any meat for ourselves, knowing that every available piece should go toward feeding a person with higher nutritional needs than our fairly privileged research team. Yet one of the truck drivers had delivered us some anyway, a gesture of appreciation that represented the deeply held community value of sharing. The meat tasted terrible to me, which was saying a lot. I had already spent months eating some extremely unfamiliar things, yet enjoying them. The giraffe meat was tough and really rich in flavor, very gamey. After spending so much time with the deceased giraffe's body and handling so much of her flesh, I could no longer separate the smell of the giraffe from the taste of the stew. Not to mention, stew needs to simmer for hours to tenderize the meat and release all the flavors, and this one hadn't been cooking nearly long enough to get those benefits. But out of respect for my team, who cleaned their plates, and even more, out of respect for the gorgeous wild animal that had lost her life that day, I ate my stew down to the last drop. Thank you. So that is a taste of one of the ways, pun not intended, but that was a good one. One of the ways that I found that I'm so fortunate that I've been able to find so many moments where my science work and my social beliefs have really been rammed together in ways that I think I know that if I had just remained in the classroom or remained in kind of safe, familiar spaces, even when doing research, I might not have had those experiences that really gave me a type of whiplash that I really needed. And to kind of transition into the end of my talk, I have had a lot of wonderful opportunities to study wild animals around the world and to aid in conservation projects and programs. And although, and I write about this in my book, there have been plenty of times that I've had some really rough moments bringing my full self into my science research, I've continued to do it. And it has helped me grow and helped me deepen and helped me explore how I think I can be the best leader that I can be in many ways. And so here's another story. I'm not going to read it, but I will tell the story. And it has to do with this skull. So I study bears. I have been studying bears for a while. So after I did many years of lion work in East Africa, in my PhD program, I transitioned to bears, which was a transition that I really fought really hard. I did a lot of crying before I finally said, okay, fine, I'll do bears, and it was the best decision I ever made. And it took me to Western Nevada, not too far from here, the Lake Tahoe Basin, but distinctly on the Nevada side of the Lake Tahoe Basin, where I was studying a population of black bears that were recolonizing historic habitat and having a pretty rough time doing it. And so this image comes from an ecology conference where I presented, and I'm holding a bear skull, which is like a very convenient prop that I have. I have this bear skull, and I just use it whenever I'm doing a boring talk on statistical methods. I bring out the bear skull. But I'm pointing to a bullet hole in the bear's head. And this was because this chapter of my dissertation was about mortality risk and looking at landscapes and doing a lot of GIS, so geographical information systems, mapping to really understand landscape dynamics and human tolerance or intolerance in different areas where black bears were trying to live. So where were they getting shot in the head and where were they safer? And I gave this presentation at the ESA conference, and so that's Ecological Society of America. It's a great conference, in 2014, summer of 2014. And that year, the conference was in Sacramento, and I was in New York City at the time in grad school. And so I flew out to San Francisco where my family, my grandparents were living. I visited them. And this was my first big presentation, okay? So this was, I was in my 20s, I was in graduate school, but this chapter of my dissertation had been accepted for a presentation, and my advisors were thrilled. I finally felt legitimized. I was like, this is it, ESA. And we're talking August of 2014. And so I had this trick. So usually if I had a long drive, I would put on whatever Beyonce album was out at the moment, still do that. But if I was going into a presentation, I would put on what I thought was like intellectual music, right? Like what radio station is for smarty pants people? Okay, the answer is NPR, always. Always, still is. So I put on NPR as I'm driving from San Francisco to Sacramento. And as I'm driving, and I made the mistake of doing that drive the day of my presentation, so kind of the morning of, right? Okay, any grad students in here, I don't recommend that. And NPR was recounting that a boy named Michael Brown had been shot by police in Ferguson, Missouri. And the community of Ferguson, which is a black community, was on fire, literally on fire, and some people called it riots, and others, described it as protests. But this boy was dead because of the police, and it was 2014, so this wasn't anything new, police brutality and the killing of unarmed black folks. But it was gaining more attention around this time. Trayvon Martin had been killed the year before. There was a number of young boys that their lives had been taken, and there were protests. And Black Lives Matter was a hashtag. And I cared very deeply about this, of course. And so I was driving to the conference, and I was listening to this news that I didn't know about until that moment. And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, I don't think I can do it. And I don't know that anyone at that conference in 2014 will really care or understand or make space for this. I walked into the conference, I didn't see any other black folks that day. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, the irony, the bitter irony of the fact that I'm supposed to be doing a presentation on where bears get shot at a time, where black bears get shot at a time when young black men and women were also getting shot by police. And it didn't appear that anyone was doing a statistical analysis on those risky areas. And walking into a space where I didn't feel that my community was represented or cared for, where I thought, gosh, there are so many different tragic events that could be happening and on the news. And I think if it were a different community that was being harmed folks might be talking about it in the coffee breaks or around the water coolers, but I don't think anyone's going to be talking about Black Lives Matter at ESA. And I bombed my presentation. I did a really bad job. It was so embarrassing. And it's 10 years later, and I still think of it. It was so humiliating. My mind wasn't there. I nearly burst into tears on stage. During the Q&A, which again was about like my resource selection probability function model outcomes, I completely bombed and just forgot about it, and I ran out of the conference crying, and I got in my car and I drove back to my grandparents' house in San Francisco, and I avoided all texts and phone calls and emails from my advisors and my colleagues who were checking up on me to wonder what happened to Rae. And since then, I've grown, and since then, I've become stronger, and since then, I've developed an articulation for what we all need to really be effective in this space of ecology or environmental science. It came back around in 2016. There was a big election in 2016, and it didn't really go our way, and Donald Trump was elected. And at that point, I was in my postdoc, and there was a lot of resistance to that election. I think a lot of us can remember. There was a big March for Science, and that was really important, and I think the first one. And on the day that there was a March for Science, no one was in the office because everyone was marching for science. That was important. And there was a women's march, and many of us wore pink hats and went down to the women's march, right? Because that was extra important, still is. And no one was in the office that day on the women's march because we were all trying to make some change. And then there was a March for Black Lives, and everyone was at work. And at that point, I remember standing up in a staff meeting and saying, okay, here's what's got to change. If we support science, we as a community, if we're saying that we support science, that means we have to support scientists. And scientists are women, and Black, and brown, and any kind of racial group, and from the LGBTIQ+ community, and immigrants, and from religious backgrounds, religious minority backgrounds. And on, any kind of target group, right? Because we are all intersectional people that come from different places. And so you don't just get to support science in a vacuum, especially when it comes to environmental sciences, the sciences that are trying to address some of the world's most pressing issues really freaking quickly, because if we don't do it fast enough, we're doomed. That's really hard to do when your community's under fire. Right? And then that leaves the only people able to work on these issues are the people with the most privilege, with maybe a single perspective. I know that it must be pretty freaking hard to figure out what kind of ecologist do I want to be when you're really not sure if your dad's going to make it home if he gets pulled over by the police. There's a lot of issues here that are actually all the same shared issue. I began preaching that one really good way to support environmental solutions is to do social justice work, because it's all linked together, and we can only get to one outcome, one positive outcome, if we solve the others. So in general, I think about biodiversity under pressure in a time of global change. And I realize that my work touches on that in a couple of different ways. Biodiversity is under pressure, and there's global change afoot. And these images come from my study site not too far from here, the Jack and Laura Dangermond Preserve, about an hour north on the coast. Some people in this room also work at that site, and that is awesome. Where we have mountain lions and bobcats and coyote and black bears and lots of other large and medium mammals that are using coastline, probably for food resources. And one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, what type of global change are these animals experiencing? Are we finding black bear tracks on the beach many mornings because that's where bears have always hunted on this beach? Or because there's some kind of pressure from another part of the ecosystem that's pushing them here? Are we finding mountain lions headed towards the coast many nights because that's something that they have always done and we haven't realized it? Or is it because there's some kind of change in a different part of their ecosystem? biodiversity under pressure in a time of global change. And global change, usually when we're talking about it, means climate change, right? And so that's also something that my work addresses. How is climate change impacting the ways that we're studying these animals? I've been studying bears for now 15 years, and climate change is kind of wreaking havoc on how we understand their dynamics and their needs and what we can do for conservation. The bears I study are supposed to hibernate, and when we have warm winters or less precipitation or wildfires due to climate change, all of our work kind of goes down the tubes, and we have to figure out how to start over. But understanding biodiversity under pressure in a time of global change, that global change can also mean social change, right? It can also mean society going in some pretty good directions. I talked about painful moments that have come up in my life and in my career, but there's also a lot of emerging discussions that are happening and that are healing. This is just one example, but National Geographic has played a big role in my life. And a few years ago, they released a statement saying, well, look at that. We have not been very fair, have we? And we have perpetuated a lot of racist ideologies just in how we photograph people around the world. These things are tough, but they're healing. And they start us in a place where we can actually get somewhere, where we can understand each other and where we can make some social change, which might make a lot of people from diverse backgrounds feel more included in this movement and feel more empowered to offer their ideas and their perceptions and their leadership. And so all I'm talking about, and I'm sorry there's a typo here, it's a really important one that I just explained, there should be an E for Audre Lorde. But Audre Lorde is one of the most amazing feminists out there, and her work set the foundation for a lot of the things that I believe these days. And she talked about intersectionality, you know, that we don't have any single issue struggles. It's not just how do we save wild animals, right? It's not that. We don't lead single issue lives. The world isn't that simple. And really broadening that, especially in the spirit of traditional Western science, ecology, conservation science, is, in my belief system, how we're going to get to some really important outcomes. And it makes sense. You know, this little girl, little me, wanted to be a nature show host when I was very small. And I made it there just recently, just literally 6 months ago it happened. So, you know, it takes 35 years to achieve your dreams. They don't tell you that when you're little. But I realized, you know, that in many ways, my life is kind of proof that, you know, intersectional identities can get you to the top and can get you into places where, you know, the work and the change can also be changing people's minds. I do a lot of research presentations, but a lot of the presentations that I do are very private. They're within conservation organizations to teach diversity, equity, inclusion, to teach open-mindedness and intersectionality as a lens for doing our work or reimagining our work. I believe that a lot of my stories kind of prove that you can be non-traditional. You don't have to grow up exploring nature or having a lot of outdoor familiarity to become a leader. And lots of people kind of need to see that. And we can all do more of that in whatever community we're part of or whatever field we represent. We can all really work to expand who belongs and how we can reimagine a lot of the philosophies that guide our work. So I think that not every kid necessarily needs to grow up and explore the outdoors every single day. It doesn't hurt. It certainly doesn't hurt. My kids are doing it. But you don't need that. What kids need are well-resourced communities, happy families, and societal support that can give everyone the dream to serve their environment in the way that they want to. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you. And I hope you all have questions because I love to chit chat, and the library staff has some a microphone that we can pass around and ask me anything. I also have heard that there are 5 o'clock classes, so if any students need to slip out, we understand.
Hi, my name is Temesgen Ghebreyesus. I'm first year Mesm student at the Brent School. First want to say thank you for the presentation. And I kind of find, quite literally yesterday around this time, I was on the phone with a colleague of mine who got her PhD here studying microplastics. And she was a Kenyan-born refugee. And she was telling me about how a lot of poachers who hunt for bushmeat actually die and are shot dead because of, basically because of how strict some anti-poaching is. And we're having a whole conversation about the racist origins of environmental science, its connections to eugenics and stuff like that. My question for you is, with your knowledge of that, where do you see the legacies of the field that we study, that sort of, its background still, its uglier side still sort of existing today? And how does that inform how you go about your work with your colleagues?
Thank you for that comment and question. And I could just be here all night talking about that. I think conservation is really challenging because the goal, I believe, is very clear. And again, you know, my interactions with conservation have almost always been wildlife conservation. But, you know, along with that goes ecosystems and landscapes. But even the word has connotations, you know, it kind of started in America, right? The term conservation is an American term. There are some really kind of bad people who were the first conservationists, right? So Teddy Roosevelt was a really racist, violent, horrible person, in my opinion. And he was one of the forefathers of conservation as we know it today. Aldo Leopold, you know, there are historians who are really finding evidence that he had very low regard for indigenous folks in this country and called for their removal from landscapes in order to create the nation's national parks. You know, like people are coming for John Muir, you know, because there's a lot of evidence that their love for nature was at the expense of respect for people, in particular people of color. And so that idea of conservation in the protected area system got brought all over the world with colonialism and neocolonialism, in particular also to parts of Kenya where your colleague might be from. Poaching really troubles me, and again, I actually at the Bren School, I taught a class the year before last on decolonizing conservation. And in the class, I told the administration, I don't know if anyone, Bren administrators are here, but they probably didn't like this, but I told them that I couldn't give out grades for this class. I couldn't do it because I really wanted us as a group of graduate students to just explore what the racialization of poaching in Africa and who is profiting from it and what do they look like and who is being incarcerated for it and what do they look like and where this is going and whether or not the incarceration of black folks in Africa is actually saving wild animals. Because one thing, you know, we've learned from the illegal drug trade here in the United States is that incarcerating those foot soldiers isn't actually stopping the influx of drugs into communities, right? But it is creating this terrible system. So I could go on, but one thing that I would call on the conservation community as a whole to really try to do, because it can't just be a few of us, is to acknowledge the colonial legacies of conservation in terms of how it's gotten us to where we are. In some ways, there are species that are doing way better because of conservation, right? Because of projects and programs. But in general, you know, we have protected areas all over the world. We've got national parks all over the place, and the majority of wild animals live outside of national parks, right? So people have been removed from them. People have died. I mean, I don't know if anyone's looking at the current news, but There was this great article recently about Maasai folks in East Africa and the fact that their livelihoods are just being driven into the ground for the sake of wildlife conservation and national parks. So solutions are out there. Solutions, in my opinion, mostly come from communities that are indigenous to that landscape. I'm a big proponent of land back. I usually don't care what it looks like, just give it back, give it back, give it back. But the other thing I will offer is to you in particular, but also to your colleague and other students as they come up, is that that's a fight. Including social justice in conservation leadership is a fight. It's not just generally accepted. And it's not always safe for people to fight that fight, right? So depending on what anyone's identity is, it might not be safe for you or productive for you to be the person engaged in that advocacy, right? So, you know, there are people from different target groups, LGBTIQ groups, religious minority groups, et cetera, where it is actually not a great idea to constantly be pushing, but perhaps people from more privileged identity groups can help in that cause. If you read my book, you can learn about when I lost my job because I talked about Black issues in the workplace, and it was very uncomfortable for everyone. And although I was doing bomb science and getting published left and right, my organization did not feel comfortable with the way that I included topics of social justice in science, and I got let go. So it's not always like if you fight the good fight, you get this wonderful experience. Sometimes it can be harmful. If anyone has ever been a whistleblower, you might know that it doesn't always turn out great for you. So what I would hate to see is a person who has so much potential to be a leader burn out, experience harm, or experience trauma because they're fighting for the right thing. So I think it's just different for every situation, for every person. And sometimes your biggest form of resistance might be just protecting yourself and protecting your energy. That's my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? And you can ask me about bears too if you want. It doesn't have to be heavy.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was wondering, looking at your very long list of impressive accomplishments, it's clear to me that you're passionate about both like on-the-ground research up close with the animals as well as kind of the more communication side and media between your writing and your podcast and Wild Kingdom. How have you kind of balanced all of those passions, and how have like those diverse interests driven your career path and the choices that you've made along the way?
Thank you for that question. I get that question a lot. And thank you also for the way you phrased it. You threw me a lot of compliments in there, so that was very kind. I am still searching for balance. So I love to give advice, you probably noticed, but I am also willing to seek advice from anyone out there who can tell me how to parent young children and to have a personal life and to have friendships and to do research and to do science communication, because I haven't quite figured it out. And so I had a really incredible mentor. Her name is Dr. Eleanor Sterling, and I actually dedicated my book to her, but she passed away last year. And she talked to me about a pendulum rather than balance. So she talked to me about a life pendulum, and she would say that if we just use like work and personal life as just two ends, she'd say sometimes the pendulum swings all the way to work, and sometimes it's all the way to personal life, but at some point it's swinging through the middle to a place that might seem more balanced, but it's always on the move. And that could be like in a single day or a single week or month or year, whatever era of your life. And that really spoke to me a lot. It helped me understand it's maybe not in balance every day, but over the course of a lifetime, maybe there's been kind of equal amounts on either side, or hopefully a lot of time in the middle. But I don't have it figured out. And And burnout is something that I, find I'm very concerned about. And the other piece of advice I will say is that by some miracle, I just love to talk and it comes easily to me. And so that's helped a lot in a lot of the science communication I've done. And I had to kind of unlearn this idea that everything needed to be hard, that hard work needed to actually be like very, very effortful. I think many of us are socialized to believe that like if you're doing good work, it's because it's like hard and energy intensive and like you're like working. And that is how science research feels to me, for sure. But that is not necessarily how public presenting or podcasting or even kind of hosting feels to me. And I think for a lot, especially for women in particular, sometimes we think, oh, if something comes easily to me, then I'm not working hard, or maybe I'm not doing a great job at it, or maybe it can't be part of my work, right? Because work is always hard, not easy. But think about it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're like love to bake or love to do graphic design or what, whatever it might be. If there is something that comes easily to you, I think it's a good exercise to try it on as an addition to whatever, if it's science research or something that you do, to see if there is a good fit. I never had training in science communication, and I'm not the best science communicator, but I've found that it comes easily to me and it brings me joy, so that helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very moving talk, even more than I'd expected. Greatly appreciated. You've dealt a lot with racism and its after effects and what's going on now. I don't know if you can separate that from being a woman, regardless of color, religion, whatever. In your field, I lived in fields as a professional where I was unusual, simply for my gender. I didn't know if you could address that and what it's like for you now.
Oh gosh. Well, I appreciate how you said that. Yes, I only know what it's like to be a Black woman, and so there's the intersection of race and gender identity there. But again, actually, the mentor who I was just naming, look her up. Can't say her name enough. Dr. Eleanor Sterling. She was one of the first women from any background to do a lot of the science research that she did. And she cut her teeth researching an animal called the ai, which lives in the jungles of Madagascar. And so with her mentorship, she really, helped me understand what it can be like to be the first or the only person from a certain group to do research in certain places. I also had the privilege of being mentored in my master's degree by a woman named Dr. Susan Clark, who's a carnivore ecologist and did a lot of work in the American West, who's a transgender woman, and transitioned in her 60s. And so she actually did most of her science career as a carnivore ecologist as like a very masculine presenting man, big beard, tall, from Wyoming, macho. And then transitioned to being female and still engaging with those groups and those communities and those scientists that she had worked with before, and experiencing all that comes with that. And so for some people, from certain target groups, there's an element of self-care that is absolutely necessary if you want to be effective. And I think that can sometimes be lost when we have such a mission-critical field, right? Like with conservation, we're just trying to like save the planet really fast, right? And so sometimes I think any of us who are in this field here can relate that sometimes you want to just always work, right? Because every little bit helps and we're in it together, and being tireless kind of seems like the right thing to do when there's a planet to save. But one time I was in a training and someone talked to me about microaggressions. And microaggressions are those little things that happen that it's not, if we talk about racism, it's not violence, but it is not okay and it's very hurtful. And someone talked about microaggressions as mosquito bites. And they said, if you get a mosquito bite one day, that's going to be annoying. You're probably going to be scratching it for the rest of the day, but it's like, it's not going to kill you, right? It's not the worst thing ever. But if you get a mosquito bite in the same place day after day, it's not going to take too long before you go frickin' crazy, before you just go crazy on that mosquito and probably everyone around you, because it'll become painful. It'll become something that is infected. It will become something that you cannot live another moment dealing with. And that's something that all of us, no matter what your background is, you've experienced a microaggression, and some of us will experience them over and over and over again. And I always have stories, but I have a little story because, you know, I don't want it to seem like a lot of these issues I face are in the past at all for me personally. So 2 months ago, I was filming Wild Kingdom in New Hampshire, and we were doing a bear episode, and that's my thing, hibernating bears, putting the GPS collars on them and doing a checkup. And we had to work with the state wildlife officials. And they work with a wildlife veterinarian, right? So not every state does that, but New Hampshire does, and I think that's great to have a vet. And so I'm with the crew. We have a small crew. It's about 4 of us, and we're in the forests of New Hampshire, and the state wildlife department rolls up in their big trucks, and 3 of them get out, and the wildlife veterinarian, who's this very outdoorsy looking guy, gets out first and greets me, and I say, hi, welcome, you know, thank you for coming, and it's me, and the camera guy who's holding the camera, and the sound guy who's holding the audio equipment, and our producer. And he goes down the line, everyone's, you know, very kind, shakes everyone's hand, and then he turns to the sound guy, and he says, you must be our bear expert. And he says, Dr. Wynn-Grant, it's great to meet you. And the sound guy's like, oh, I just do the microphones. I'm not, it's her. And the sound guy was this tall, rugged looking, like he was like dressed for, I mean, I was also dressed for the day, but he was also, you know, just dressed in black. And he had this beard, right, like a scruffy beard and a beanie, and he looked like a nature show host. And then there was me, dressed the exact same, but I did not look like neither a nature show host or someone who had a PhD in ecology and evolution with a focus in bear behavior. And it was a microaggression, you know, and I said, no, buddy, that's me, I'm the bear expert, you're here to see me, and I'm gonna walk you through what we're doing today. And it was something that, like, I obviously still think about, but it didn't ruin my day. But it happens a lot. It happens a whole lot.
What was his reaction when you did that? Because sometimes that ameliorates the feeling.
He was kind and apologetic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was not hostile. He handled it well. He definitely apologized. But before that happened, there was a moment of like, wait, what? Like what? You know, like people always have to regroup. It happened to me a couple days ago. I landed at the airport and I had a car service waiting, which was very fancy, and they have, you know, Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant listed at baggage claim, and this happens all the time, every time I get picked up. But I walked over and I said, "Hi, it's me," and the person was saying like, "Oh no, I'm looking for someone else." And I always say, "It's Rae Wynn-Grant." I pull up my ID and I said, "This is me, Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant. It's me." And the person does a regroup and then apologizes and is very kind. So anyway, I think that for some of us who may not experience microaggressions that much, thinking of the mosquito bite example has really helped me a lot. That sometimes it's tolerable and sometimes it's not. And it's always not okay. And we can all work together to help minimize those for people from any target group. Thanks for your question.
Hi, Rae. It's wonderful to see you. Full disclosure, I'm friends with Rae, and I just wanted to point out something really wonderful about this university that is a little bit unique. First off, we had a bit of a similar parallel path. My name's Chris Jenkins, and I teach in the Film and Media Studies department. At one point in my life, I was giving a talk about Africa, and the cameraman from Wild Kingdom was there. It began a wonderful friendship, and now we have, years later, long story short, the original cameras from Wild Kingdom are here at UCSB, and the students get to work with them. And I just wanted to say your mentorship is wonderful. Really love it.
Oh, right back at you, Chris. Thank you. This man has an incredible reputation, not just on campus, but worldwide. And when I travel places, people ask me if I know Chris Jenkins in the film department. So thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
Am I doing this right? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I recently read something that is helping me to change my whole way of thinking, and I'm saying it to you because if you also think it's worth thinking about, you're in a position where maybe you could make people think about it. Anyway, it's that the old part of the brain that's been there for millions of years, that's based, kind of on fight or flight, and what group you belong to, and all that, and it's been in there for millions of years. And then there's the new part of the brain, which is kind of undeveloped. And I'm just wondering if it might be helpful for all of society to be thinking in terms of, okay, I have this old part of my brain that just kind of forces me to, I just do knee-jerk responses, like that person's not from my group. But if we trained everyone to think first, okay, my immediate response before I do it, is it coming from the old brain or is it coming from the new brain? Because maybe it needs to be that specific to get everybody to change in the ways that you want things to change. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Well, thank you. Listen, we need more hypotheses and we need more theories that we can test because we are all trying to get to the same goal, right? I think all of us in here can agree that we want a safe, harmonious globe free of war and violence and hate. And different people have different ideas of how to get there. But I'm all for the primitive brain, controlling one's primitive brain and really testing to see if just taking a beat before reacting could work. I'll chit chat with you later, but I was going to say there's a really good podcast out there. I don't listen to my own podcast, but there's one that's a feminist coaching podcast, and it's really based in that neuroscience of primitive brains that early humans evolved to have, and how we can really try to manage that part of our brain as a way to reduce anxiety and fear in the workplace. So if anyone out there also gets freaked out when they read an email, talk to me about this podcast to listen to, but similar idea. So that is real science that is kind of going on.
Okay, so there's 2 questions here, and I know Ellen has one, and then if you have more questions, you can meet Dr. Wynn-Grant out at the in the lobby, okay?
How did you know that you wanted to be a wildlife ecologist as opposed to a bear biologist or a lion biologist?
Yeah, great question. Oh, man. I didn't know. I really didn't know. I took a class in my master's program. I had a, kind of a course-based master's degree and took a landscape ecology class, and I really liked my professor. My landscape ecology professor was nice and approachable and held office hours that I felt comfortable in, and the way he talked about landscape ecology was really thrilling. And so after taking his class versus different biology classes, I thought oh, well, it must be ecology that I love rather than this person's teaching style. And I think probably lots of people, if you surveyed a lot of your professors or even other heroes in your life, probably have stories about being very influenced by good teachers, as opposed to the exact right fit of the field. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the way to go and that's the way to choose your career path, but there's something to that, and that's why I really ended up in the wildlife ecology space rather than the biology space. I'm very fortunate, though, that in my ecology research, I've often worked with biologists, mostly in state wildlife agencies, so I have to partner with them. And sometimes I'm jealous of them because I'm like, oh, you spend every day with wild animals. Oh, that's kind of cool. Like I spend a lot of days with like statistical modeling software, but you spend every day in the field. And I've found that is pretty cool and definitely something to think about. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that more later too.
Hi, it's so great to meet you again and hear you speak. It's been so inspiring. And I was wondering what has been the most meaningful project so far in your career, because I'm also interested in science communications and have received mentorship from Chris. So that was what I was wondering. And also, what recommendations do you have for students trying to follow in your footsteps?
Oh my gosh, you thought about these questions, the most meaningful project. My most meaningful science communication project. Okay, hands down, my podcast. I have a podcast called Going Wild, and it's with PBS Nature. And if you skip over season 1, which is my stories, and you get to seasons 2 and 3, I have guests on every episode, and they're all Black. Season 2, everyone's Black. And season 3, everyone's Black or Indigenous. And they are wildlife ecologists. And so they tell stories like the one that I read here, just from their crazy adventures with wild animals around the world, and kind of the parallel adventure or journey in identity that they experienced along with it. And the guests that I have had on my podcast are mostly people that I know really well already, that they're just part of my community, but oh my gosh, the stories are so rich. And it has been such a privilege and something I've loved to like shut up about what I've done and amplify someone else's really amazing storytelling. You know, you laugh, you cry a lot, but they're not tragic stories, but you just cry because they're rich. And they're happy stories. So, you know, it's interesting how that happens. But that project has been so meaningful for me and to a lot of the people that I've had as guests. And it's been really cool for PBS, too. Like, they thought they were getting a podcast about wild animal adventures, and they're getting podcasts about, like, you know, how studying bees helped someone come out of the closet, or how, you know, P22, the famous mountain lion, is actually raising a lot of issues about indigenous rights in Southern California. And so it's been interesting to see how PBS has really opened up, PBS Nature, I should say, has really opened up as an organization to doing some things differently and maybe more intersectionally in the spirit of talking about nature to as many people as we can. What was your second question?
What recommendations do you have for students trying to follow a similar career path?
Oh gosh, okay, what recommendations for students trying to follow a similar career path? Probably don't wing it as much as I did. I stumbled into things. But I would also say that the recommendation I usually have for students is to really lean into your mental health and wellness. Not just for science communication, but for any part of the environmental field. It's hard, right? It's going, but there's a lot of worry that we're not going to get to the places we need to be. But there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of really positive possibilities, but a lot of effort is required. And we don't have a lot of good models of self-care and wellness. So I find that a lot of young people or students want to rush. So especially when I talk to high schoolers, they're like, well, you know, what kind of summer volunteer work can I do? Or what kind of internship can I get into? And this is just my opinion, but I usually say, like, you know, only do that volunteer work if you don't also need money. You know, only do that extra internship if you really have the extra time. Because enjoying your life is also a big part of having enough energy to work in the environmental movement. I don't know, I didn't get outside until I was 20 years old. I was a waitress all through college and grad school again. I didn't always do the extra thing or have the extra internship, but I think it kept me rooted to different parts of me that were really important to stay rooted to. And also money is important. So like if you can't find it in the environmental field, like find it somewhere on the side. But what you don't need is to just like kill yourself for the environment, but also not have your own foundation. Taking care of yourself is really important. Yeah. I'll be in the hallway, y'all, for books. Thank you. Right? Oh, no, did you have a question? I'll do it later.
Okay, one more question.
Okay, sorry, I jumped the gun. I have to. This
That's
is
okay,
the
that's
boss
okay.
gets fast.
This will be an easy one. This will be an easy one. So you shared with us that you're interested in being a host of a wildlife show since you were very young.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the best part of being the host on Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom?
Oh, yes. So I wasn't shy about my dreams to be on TV and kind of talk about nature on TV. And so in more recent years, I was getting contacted by producers, which was kind of cool, but they'd be doing shows, no offense to these shows, but they would be doing shows like Survivor or Naked and Afraid, or Naked something else, you know? And so for a long time, I was like, this is never going to happen. I'm never going to be on TV. It's not. I can't. This ain't adding up. And so probably one of my favorite things about Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, at least this iteration of the show, is that it is nerdy and factual and like very straightforward, okay? It is about conservation science through and through. And it's very dignified in that way. So I feel really great that, you know, I was saying to my husband, I call it the reading rainbow of nature shows. Like it is, like you know what you're getting and it is safe. But again, it's credible. And a lot of television shows are sensational or, you know, have like fake elements. And this show leans more towards being maybe less fantastical in the name of being real. And I appreciate that a lot. So it's a show that so far I can just stand by it and I believe in it strongly and I have my dignity at the same time.
I'm sorry to add, but that is something that's really wonderful to hear to young people in the audience, and actually to the older ones too, being true to oneself and be true to what you want and don't try to do shortcuts.
And it might take 35 years, yeah, that too.